So, from Practically Creative again, this is week two or episode two of my podcast, Memories of Growing Up in Appalachia. And what I'm doing each week is I'm doing some kind of crafty project while I chit chat about memories from growing up, lots of stories about family members who've passed, about traditions and such that I learned growing up there and a whole lot of sewing while we're doing this. So I'm going to try to make it so you can see my camera, me, and my sewing machine, and we'll go from there. So let's get you moved over here, or me or the sewing machine. So you're going to get the sewing machine, and I'm going to talk. Now, what I'm doing this week is I call this basically string piecing a block, and I've got pieces left over from making my little basket last week. And I'm just going to start putting some of those pieces on here using a roughly quarter-inch seam allowance. And I'm just going to sew those on while we chit-chat. No instructions for how to string piece, really. It's just going to be me and the sewing machine and you guys. And if you have questions about what I'm doing down here on this crazy thing, let me know. I'll be happy to tell you what's up. But this week I want to talk about food. I mentioned very much in passing last week that my first memory was watching my ma'am, which is, for those who aren't from Kentucky, she is my great grandmother on my mom's side. She was my granny's mom, and that my first memory was watching her kill a chicken. That is actually my very first memory of life, is watching my great grandma kill a chicken. Watched her pick it up and do all the stuff that is required to take a chicken from the dooryard, which is what we called it, over to the kitchen table. And by that point, I'm sure she didn't have any kids left at home to feed, but she'd been feeding herself and my grandpa, who I called Pap, for a long time. And it was just second nature. And the reason I think it might be important to talk about Ma'am is because there's a lot of people these days who are talking about food security and homesteading and prepping and all that stuff. Now, at Ma'am's house, nothing went to waste. If you didn't eat it off your plate, someone else was going to eat it. I don't know who that someone else was always going to be, but somebody was going to eat it. Nothing went to waste. Everybody had food. Everybody had stuff to eat. And if you walked away from Ma'am's table hungry, same as with my granny, it was your own fault. There was always plenty there for everybody to eat. There was also always plenty of work. I wrote a story in college about what I remembered, and probably in my brain I've tied together our babysitter from when I was a kid with Ma'am, because Ma'am had a garden, Ma'am canned food, and she put everything up. And if you've never heard that term, I'm sorry. That's what we called it, was putting it up. You put up food every year towards, bad times. You canned it or you cooked it. They hunted for squirrel and they hunted for whatever. They just, if they got it in their hot little hands and it was edible, it was going to be eaten or saved to be eaten. And I don't think much got wasted. I can't tell you for sure I've ever eaten raccoon, but I know I've eaten squirrel and deer and bear and snake and a whole bunch of other stuff that some days I'd rather not think about. So if you grew up like I did and whatever they caught is what you ate. You might be from the from the hills. So Mam was always working on something. Um, I can remember canning, husking corn so it could be canned or cooked. I can remember making jelly out of things that, as an adult, even though I can, I would never consider making jelly out of. Corn cobs, watermelon rinds. I have seen lima beans. I've helped pick lima beans and can them. I despised lima beans as a kid. As an adult, I found a renewed love for lima beans. Turns out that they taste a whole lot better when you cook them with a little bit of salt instead of just boiling the daylights out of them for a week or two. And that's how my babysitter cooked them. She just boiled the daylights out of them until they screamed for mercy, and then that was that. You ate them. And I hated lima beans for years and years because of that. And it wasn't like they came out of the frozen section or out of a can. These came out of her garden. And I can remember going down cellar. Anybody else know that term? I can remember going down cellar to get jars of whatever and to get potatoes and onions. And they were always kept in a big dirt bin under the house. And there was almost always either a mouse or a snake or a spider. I hated going in the cellar. You guys may have had a different experience, but I hated going in the cellar. Cut that off because I don't want to waste that fabric. But anyway, all these people these days are talking about canning food and preserving food and dehydrating food, and there's such a thing as a freeze dryer that you can buy for at home. And I'm like, a freeze dryer? What would you need with a freeze dryer at home? I don't think food normally lasts long enough to get freeze dried at my house, but it might. You never can tell. Um, when my kids were growing up, I always had a little garden. Usually I had like a little 2 foot or 4 foot patch by 8 foot, and I would grow some lettuce and some tomatoes and cucumbers or beans, stuff that's easy to grow. And if you want to grow stuff like that, that stuff you just basically put seeds in the ground and start growing. If you want to get into the more complicated stuff, not much of it's really complicated. It's just a matter of you have to do a little more work to get it done. If you want to get into stuff like that, you should. You should get out there and put some seeds in the ground, put your hands in the dirt. I remember Mam saying that. When, once you get your hands in the dirt, you're going to want your hands to always be dirty. And pretty much, I always want something growing. Even if it's just, some basil in a pot on the windowsill or some aloe. Aloe is one of those essentials. I don't think I've ever lived anywhere where I didn't have at least some aloe and some ivy growing. I can't think. Most of my family has at least aloe and ivy. I have some ivy that was from my mom's house. When she passed, I took what was left of her ivy plant. It had been sadly neglected for a bit. And I still have pieces of that ivy all over my house, and I'm pretty sure that several of my aunts have pieces of mom's ivy growing in their house. I mean, that plant, I can remember it in the 1970s. It grew so big that we had it wrapped around the curtain rods in the mobile home we lived in. I'm not allowed to say the word trailer. My mama will turn in her grave if I do. We had it growing around the curtain rods, and mom drugged that everywhere she went. And when she passed, there was still a big pot full of it. It had mostly died because she had been in hospice for several weeks and no one had been there tending to her plants. We'd all been in and out of hospice trying to tend to mom. But I took a big piece of that home with me. And like I said, several of my family members have now got pieces of it growing in their houses. And what I'm doing here is I'm just cutting some pieces off some scraps that are laying over here to my right. Put it on this little block. This one's kind of got a blue theme to it, not intentionally, but it does. And you may notice that my seams aren't necessarily going straight. I'm going to do even more to this because I've got a bunch of little pieces of fabric that I cut for something. And I'm going to put them on top of this too. Anyway, going back to food security. My man would probably laugh at people who say, oh, I'm a homesteader or a prepper. There wasn't any such thing in man's day. If you wanted to eat, you better be gardening. If you wanted something to, put in your stomach over the winter, you better be canning some food or milking the cow, raising the chickens. So you got your eggs and your butter and your milk and all that stuff. And she'd probably just be going, what is all this? I'm quite certain she would think we'd all lost our minds. Because it wasn't a big deal. It was just, this is what you did. Killed a pig, you processed down the lard, you used everything except the oink, as she would have phrased it. And you just used it all. It wasn't, there was no, oh, you can elect not to have a garden, or you can elect not to have a chicken or a cow or pigs or whatever. You wanted to eat, you better have that stuff on your homestead. And she had all that stuff. And it was a cycle. I mean, I do it here, and I don't think a whole lot about it. But some of my friends tell me that they think it's weird that whenever I cut open a cantaloupe, I save all the seeds and the shell and the rinds. I know it's not called shells, but I save all the outside stuff and make sure it gets fed to the chickens. Well, I don't find that weird at all. Where I come from, that's just how it's done. You want your chickens to give you feed and meat and all that stuff. Well, you better be giving them something to eat. And our chickens follow us everywhere. They'll come up on the porch and peck on the door. If they're out, they're not always out. They'll come peck on the door and let you know that they're interested in having something to eat or drink. Or my chickens like dog food, and sometimes that's what it takes to get them to go back in their coop at night. Give them a little bit of dog food. You saw I just put that together. I'm just gonna sew down that side real quick of the block itself. This is all gonna get trimmed. This is all just scrap pieces that are over here. And I'm just trying to use them into something. The cows follow the bucket around because they know food comes out of that bucket. And all the creatures, just, you have to take care of your critters. That's just all there is to it. And if you don't take care of your critters, they're not going to take care of you. So if you don't take care of your cow, she isn't going to give you milk. You have to get her bread every once in a while. Facts of life is cows have to be mommies before they can give milk. So, all that stuff. And I'm amazed. I do watch several prepper channels and I really enjoy them. Not criticizing anything any of them are doing. But I am surprised at how many people don't know, like, where stuff comes from. It's a real challenge. I think that we should be teaching, kids in school where stuff comes from. They used to have, and I don't know, maybe they still do, FFA in schools. And I know out here where we live, they have a lot of um, 4-H. Is 4-H still common in the cities, or is it only in rural areas these days? So all that stuff is important to know, and I think it's important for kids to know. This on there. I want that. Maybe I want it right there. But I think it's important for kids to know where food comes from. When I was a kid, there wasn't any turning up your nose because there was something you didn't think you liked on your plate. It was, do you want to eat tonight? Well, then I suggest you eat. And that was pretty much the way it went. I remember Bambi came out, and everybody was all like, oh, terrible. The hunters killed the mother, all that stuff. Yeah, well, it happens. But you didn't get the option in the house I grew up in of saying, oh no, the hunters killed the mommy and I'm not going to eat deer. Because you'd go hungry for a while if you didn't eat deer or squirrel or whatever else was going on the plate. My grandfather, when we moved to Florida, was amazed that none of my mom's kids said a word whenever he told us that the pig on the table was the pig we've been taking food to out in the barn for the last week or 2 weeks or whatever it was. And we were there when they, turned that pig into food for the table. It wasn't a shock to us that the pig that had been out in the barn last week was now on the table. We were just like, oh, okay. And we ate our dinner. That's how we were raised. I hope that's not controversial. People, it just was what it was. They said, here's food. You sat down and said, that's good. Even if it wasn't good, you sat down and ate it anyway. And that was just the way it was for us. I'm going to have to do a pool. I will do the pool. Now I've got that one. You can tell there is no rhyme or reason to how I'm doing what I'm doing, right? Okay. As long as y'all got that, we're good. So anyway, like I said, I remember helping with the canning and the cleaning and the picking and the growing. I can remember eating tomatoes right straight off the vine, sneaking a salt shaker out of the house, go down to the field and eat some tomatoes that were right off the vine. As a kid, I never thought to ask, how come Granny had 43 salt shakers? Probably should have told me something. I didn't realize that back then. But she had a bunch of salt shakers. And there was never any shortage of them. I don't remember ever going, I wish there was a salt shaker around here so I could go eat a tomato off the vine. I always remember going into Granny's kitchen and finding a salt shaker. And thinking, oh, yay, there's one here for me. And there's probably, I was a kid, so that was 50 years ago. There's probably still salt shakers popping up on that land. for whoever farms it now, if anybody does, there's probably still salt shakers there. Because I know we lost as many as we took down there. We were little, we were, 6, 7, 8. My sister was tiny. She was 3 or 4. We'd go down to the field and just sit there and eat tomatoes until we were done. And quite a few times where we went back after a visit to the field, and we were too full to have dinner because we'd already filled up on tomatoes. But I remember all those days very fondly. And I still am amazed whenever someone starts talking about it being a big thing to do food preparation or homestead or whatever. We live on a 5-acre farm. We eat some of our own animals. We've got some cows that aren't producing milk or calves right now. A little bit like, why do we still have cows? But that's because of other things that have been going on. Hard to take a cow to a butcher who's not open. And there's been a lot of them that haven't been open through the last couple of years because of various things to do with pandemics and world news, And we're not getting into any of that. That's just not what this is all about. But if you want to learn how to garden, then you should probably find the closest, oldest person you can find and ask them to teach you what they know. And I am finding myself becoming the closest, oldest person most people know. That's scary, actually. I'm going back and forth between a zigzag and a straight stitch here. Sorry, guys. I'm just trying to cover all the top of this. And I call this string quilting. I know that some people call it string quilting when they're putting long strings all the way across, and I do that too. But what I'm doing right now is just trying to fill up this piece of fabric and use my scraps to do it. Maybe, just maybe, create something that I think is pretty. It'll go into a quilt anyway. And kind of with my grandparents, that's where my mindset comes from. That's why I'm practically creative, is because when I grew up, you dealt with, you used what you had. So if what you had was a bunch of leftovers from somebody's clothes, that's what you used. If what you had was some scarecrow fabric that your mama had made you some pants out of way back when, that's what you used. So I'm definitely that person. I want to use up what I have and try to make sure it turns out to be something pretty. But I'm more impressed with practical than pretty. I want to be creative and use up all my little skills. And I kind of think that Ma'am would be proud of me if she were here. I'm positive Granny would be proud of me because she was always proud of me no matter what. And me and all my cousins. It wasn't just me. My granny was that person who encouraged everybody. I'm not as good as she was at it. I try. But she wasn't overtly or outwardly religious, but whenever I think she lived the golden rule more than a lot of people that I've ever known that claim to be religious. I grew up, and now that I'm older, I'm like, oh my, that was really intense. Okay, so now I got this flower. See, I told you it wasn't just going to be strings. I'm going to put some more stuff on here. I'm going to do a straight stitch around this flower though, because that's what I feel like I should be doing. And anybody who's been on my channel for very long probably knows that I'm okay with frayed edges. And I know I'm talking about things I don't usually talk about on my sewing channel. But this is a special podcast just for memories. I figure I can bring up the memories I want to bring up, or the ones that float to the top of my brain. That's probably more like what's going on. Because I didn't even know I remembered some of this stuff. But back to food preservation. You preserved whatever there was to preserve. I knew more than one person who had a coonskin hat when I was a kid and was proud of it. They had caught the coon and done all the skin drying and whatever needs to be done to that. I don't know anything about tanning, but they had done all that work themselves and were mighty darn proud of that hat. There was a fellow that walked around town, and that's what I called him, the coon hat man. I had no clue what his name was. He was never mean. He was just always wore his coon hat. He probably was, a minister of something. Might have been a city councilman for all I know. It's been that many years since I have been back to where I grew up at. I can tell you that everybody up and down my street had a garden, and that I learned how from one of our neighbors how to hunt sang. Anybody know what sang is? I could tell you there was a man in our town, Junior Riddle. Tell me that ain't a name. And he bought as much sang, and that's ginseng for people who aren't from, West Virginia. He bought as much sang as you could bring him. I have no clue what he used it for. For all I know, he was making opium in his garage or selling it to somebody in China for ginger root or something. I don't know. But Mr. Riddle would buy everybody's ginseng. And there was a guy on Key Hall who looked just like Junior Riddle to me. And he always wore a white t-shirt and blue overalls, had a short haircut, black hair. That's who I always thought that guy was when I was growing up. And I'd see him on TV, and then, I'd end up at his place with Dixie from up the road, selling him ginseng. I don't remember what it cost, but I remember going to the woods with her and looking for ginseng as a kid. And I remember her saying to him one time, $25, that ain't enough for anything. Well, that's what she got paid, so I guess that's it. That was enough, because that's all she got out of it. But Dixie had a garden, and we all lived in trailers. I mean, it's not like we lived in mobile homes. Yes, Mother, I heard you. We all lived in mobile homes. And we all lived up and down the street, and we all had a little lot, and everybody had a little garden out behind their house. Even the old man across the road. I think there was two of them. There was Mr. Tingler and Mr. Hatfield. And those two gentlemen were extremely crusty about you being in their yards. They had their gardens, and they always grew more green beans and more zucchini than they needed. Nobody ever grew more tomatoes than they needed because everybody canned tomatoes. But I can remember him coming out to the road and trying to talk us kids into taking zucchini home. Oh, your mama wants some of this zucchini. Take it home to her. And my mama had us under strict instructions. Don't you take no more zucchini from him. I don't have any more room in the freezer for it. Because you can't can zucchini. It's one of those squashes you can only freeze. You either cook it and eat it or you freeze it. And it gets old after a while. I know nowadays they put it in bread, they put it in all kinds of stuff. Back then the only thing you could do with zucchini was either eat it raw, which is not good, or you could chop it up and freeze it and then fry it when it came out of the freezer. I don't love zucchini that much. I definitely don't love fried zucchini that much. So if you're out there and you're trying to learn some food tips and tricks and trying to teach yourself how to homestead, you'd probably do really well to go talk to somebody who grew up like my granny grew up, or like my mama grew up, where your grocery store was in your front yard. And maybe we all ought to think a little bit more about going back to having our grocery store in the front yard. All right, or the backyard. All right, guys, so I have got my little string piece block here. I've got a little heart that has some heat and bond glue on the back of it I'm going to put on here. And all I'm going to do now is I'm going to take it and I'm going to iron it all flat. And then I will trim up along those edges where the fabric overhangs. And then this will go up on my quilt design wall. And I will use it in the next utility quilt I make. And I don't know if you guys know what a utility quilt is. I'll just say real quick. For me, a utility quilt is basically any quilt that's meant to be used. It's not, I don't make quilts for pretty. I make quilts to do things like, throw into the baby on the floor who needs a place to nap, or for your dog to drag around, or for you to throw in the back of the car, so in case you get stranded somewhere, you have a blanket to lay over you if it's cold. I sent a quilt to my cousin's daughter, and her daughter put it up and hung it over the edge of the crib and was like, oh, look what, they call me Aunt Melissa because a lot of them kids are the age of mine, even though they're my cousins. But she's like, oh, look what Aunt Melissa sent me. And they sent me a picture of it all hanging up in pride of place. And I was like, y'all can box that up and send it back to me. My cousin was like, why? I said, because that wasn't intended to be a showpiece. It was intended to be used. I said, you put it on the floor or on the ground, let that baby crawl on it. I said, if she really wants a special quilt for when, once the baby gets older, I'll make her another quilt. But when I make a quilt for a baby, I intend for it to be used. All right, guys, so there's my string block, and that's my little run my mouth time for today. Y'all have a great week, and I'll see you next week on more Memories from Appalachia.